As the sun slowly set, shadows stretched across the gravestones. The scent of the earth was cool, damp, mingling with the fragrance of freshly laid flowers. My fingers trembled as I held the bouquet. The name on the stone still felt unfamiliar to me. Amara Weber, 1959, 2024. This woman had been my mother for years, but she never felt like a mother to me. Or maybe, I never let myself feel that way. She was the woman who wore shabby clothes, who shouted when she spoke, who yelled across the street at acquaintances without shame, who argued with neighbors, who bought bruised fruit at the market. She was my source of shame. And I tried to become someone else. Quietly, stubbornly, as far from her as possible. Better schools, more polished friends, more respectable partners. My only goal growing up? Not to become my mother. But now, she stood before me. Stone. Silent. And for the first time, we were alone. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the envelope, cream-colored, with a single handwritten note in old-fashioned script. To my daughter Layla, be alone before opening. My eyes blurred. The first time I saw this envelope, the lawyer had handed it to me after the funeral. She wanted you to open it when you're alone, he'd said. It's in her handwriting. Not part of the will, but something she cared about. Now I was alone. No one else in the cemetery. Only stones, wind, and a gently swaying cypress branch. I opened the envelope. There was a single page inside. The lines, written in ballpoint pen, slanted a little but were clear. Layla, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And you're still angry with me. But now, it's my turn to speak. I didn't just raise you. I protected you from my life. There are things you need to know. Before anything else, please go back. Do you remember the chest in the back room of the house? Inside are things that belong to you, and truths I never told. Start over. But this time, bring the past with you. Amara. My knees weakened. The chest in the back room of that old house? I used to dig through it as a child. Sewing boxes, old photos, tattered notebooks. My mother's life had always been a mess, and stayed that way. But now, these words reached out like a thread through the years. I lifted my head, stared long at the gravestone. So now it's up to me to face your past? I whispered. But deep down, I already knew the answer. I used to think the past belonged only to her. Turns out, the emptiness inside me was everything she never said. Entering the house was harder than opening the chest. The loneliness that greeted me at the door didn't make a sound, but it screamed. Everything was in its place, except my mother. The house still smelled like her. A faint trace of mothballs, a hint of detergent, and something old, something long gone. I took off my shoes, tiptoed my way to the back room. It was the room where I used to play as a child, but one I hadn't even opened since growing up. The gray curtains were drawn, the light was dim. The room was cluttered with what my mother used to call old things: a sewing machine, a broken iron, rugs rolled up in the corner, a rusty ironing board, and in the corner, the chest. I knelt and opened the lid. A voice inside whispered, "Are you ready?" But my hands had already unlatched the lock. The hinges creaked. Dust rose, scratching my throat. Inside, it looked ordinary. Balls of wool, a few sewing patterns on top. I dug deeper. Yellowed envelopes, old letters, some never opened. But what caught my eye was a small black notebook at the bottom, hardbound, frayed at the edges. I flipped through the pages, each one filled with handwriting. My mother's handwriting. But the first sentence froze me in place. I wasn't Amara. That name was never mine. I swallowed hard. What did she mean? Was my mother someone else? The notebook trembled in my hands, or maybe I was trembling. I kept reading. I changed my name because I couldn't live with my past. Layla, I didn't tell you everything. It wasn't my fault, but maybe I was the reason behind the shame you carried. And I want to change that. In this notebook, I will tell you the version of me you never knew. I didn't lie, but I kept so much silent. I couldn't close the notebook. I stayed there, kneeling, frozen. What stirred inside me wasn't anger, and it wasn't curiosity either. It was something I hadn't felt in years, a longing to be close to my mother. In the other corner of the chest, I found a pouch. I opened it. Inside was a tiny bracelet. It had a single letter engraved on it, D. My baby bracelet. Right beside it, a yellowed newspaper clipping. The date, 1985. Headline, Young Woman Missing. Family's Search Turns Desperate. I squinted at the article. The name was unfamiliar. But the photo, it was her. Younger, tired, but unmistakably my mother. That night, I sat beside the chest until morning, reading, letting the weight inside me shift, page by page. That house, it was like a museum of secrets. And all my life, I had only looked at the exhibits from behind the glass. The pages of the notebook turned slowly. Each word felt like my mother's voice. She had written in such a simple, direct way. As I read the first lines, I covered my forehead with my hand. Because for the first time, I thought of her as a woman, not just mom, but a person with a story of her own. I didn't choose the name Amara. It's easy to say I lost my identity. But the truth is, I had to leave it behind. My real name was Gülçin. I was 19, living in Adana. My father worked at the municipality. He was a strict man. He controlled everything. Even when my mother and I made eye contact, she would flinch. The air in our home burned hotter than the summer sun outside. The sentences paused, but the emotions they left behind walked right into me. Between those lines lived my mother's youth, a past I had never known, a different city, a life lived and hidden behind walls. I finished high school, but I wasn't allowed to go to university. What good is an educated woman? My father said. But I studied in secret. My biggest dream was to go to Ankara. I got accepted into medical school. But my father decided to marry me off, said our honor was at stake. That night, everything changed. To avoid marrying that man, I ran away before dawn. I had only 120 lira and a train ticket with me. That night, Gülçin died. She left with that train car. In a new city, I would become a new woman, Amara. I paused, placed my fingers on the notebook's edge. A silent weight settled over me. The woman I had always been ashamed of had erased her identity to exist, that old coat I despised. It hadn't been a symbol of shame, it had been her only piece of freedom. To disappear, I had to change my identity. Fake documents, a birth date that wasn't mine. My first job in Istanbul was at a tea house, then a textile workshop. I cried every night from exhaustion, but still showed up again every morning. I had no one. No one knew me, and that became my greatest freedom. It was as if dried tears had been pressed into the paper. My hands felt warm around the notebook. Becoming Amara hadn't been the reason I felt ashamed of her. She was simply trying to survive. Maybe that was all she ever did. And I had always judged her by her voice, her clothes, her behavior. I had reduced her to the smallest things. How shallow I had been. That night, I slid the notebook beneath my pillow and tried to sleep. In my dream, I saw her. She was young, no headscarf, sitting in a train car, looking out the window. Her eyes weren't crying, but her hands were trembling. I tried to reach her, but the train began to move. When I woke up, my throat was tight. I knew I had to do something. This notebook, it wasn't something to just read, it was something I had to understand. When I arrived in Istanbul, dawn had just broken. Near the ferry docks, I saw people sleeping on pieces of cardboard. Some had their eyes open, but they weren't really looking. That morning, I learned how to look like that too, afraid, but without showing it. My mother had written that first day in painstaking detail. She had no money, no place to stay. She wore a summer dress, carried a faded bag with a few pieces of clothing inside. That was it. She had erased her past and started from zero in a city that didn't know her. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. I sat in parks, tried to hide that I was a woman, wrapped my hair in a scarf, leaned my back against walls. I stayed awake even when I was exhausted, never closed my eyes. For 3 days, I survived on a single bagel and 2 cups of tea. On the fourth day, a woman approached me. Her name was Suna. She had a plastic bag with bread and tomatoes inside. She looked at me and said just one word. Hungry? It was the first time someone truly saw me. Tears filled my eyes, but I looked down. Come stay with us, she said. We're from the shelter. Reading those words, my own eyes welled with tears. Because I remembered how strict and cold my mother had always seemed. How she'd immediately say, "No, thank you," whenever someone offered help. How she acted ashamed to accept anything. And yet, she too had once been in need. The place Suna mentioned was a women's shelter, on the outskirts of the city, in an old apartment. 7 women lived there together, each with her own story. One had fled her husband, one had been thrown out by her family, another had run from a forced marriage. In the beginning, I didn't speak. I avoided eye contact. When asked my name, I said Amara. I didn't say Gülçin. I knew I had to leave that name behind. Suna found me a job, a cleaning position at a small workshop. They paid 100 lira a month. It wasn't much, but it was life. The day I received my first salary, I cried. Because that day, I finally felt I didn't need anyone. The silences between the lines weighed heavier than the words. My mother had carried her loneliness like a prison cell. But quietly, with each step, she had built a future. Maybe that's why she always seemed so harsh. Maybe her silence wasn't weakness. It was armor. A thick shell built for survival. I had thought she was cold, but she had simply built a life without noise. Because every time she had raised her voice, something bad had happened. She had learned, silence can be protection. Living among women made me feel safe. But it also filled me with fear. Because some of them had left their children behind. Some had fled with their children. I made a promise to myself. If I ever had a child, I would never leave them, and I would never let anyone look down on them. Not even me. That last line hit me hard. Because I had always mistaken her decision as control, when in truth, she didn't want to leave me alone because she had grown up alone. And all that effort, I had found it suffocating. I held the notebook in my lap. My eyes drifted to the next page. A new section had begun. At the top, a single word was written. Him. The man who had brought me into this world. How had she met him? Who was he? What empty place had he stepped into? The answers waited on the next page. In my 3rd month at the women's shelter, they called me from the workshop. Not for cleaning this time. They needed someone to work in the ironing section. My fingers were ready to burn, because for the first time, I was being accepted somewhere as a worker. This part of the notebook told the story of my mother's first taste of existence. She would wake before the morning call to prayer, take 2 buses to the factory in Bayrampaşa, and return after dark. During lunch breaks, she often nodded off in her chair, and the burn marks on her hands grew deeper every week. But in every sentence, there was a change. It was as if Amara's voice was growing stronger. The factory was loud, but I was quiet. I didn't ask many questions. I just did my job. Everyone else talked, especially him. He worked in safety. He stood out. The dark green apron, dust-covered shoes, and the bandages on his hands. Everyone called him Umar, but I knew his laugh before I knew his name. Here, for the first time, emotion seeped into the lines. Amara wasn't just surviving anymore. She was beginning to hold on to something or someone. One day, during the tea break, the kettle's plug sparked. I jumped back, startled. He bent over, unplugged the cable, then turned to me and smiled. "Don't be afraid. You're not alone." That sentence echoed in my mind for days. You're not alone. It was as if I had been waiting to hear that my whole life. But then, I got scared. Because getting close to someone meant risking exposure. And if I revealed who I was, everything could fall apart. These words revealed her inner struggle. A man who brought her comfort, but a past she had to hide. The fear that Gülçin could be found, that revealing her truth would destroy what little she'd built. But Ömer didn't give up. Every day, at the same time, he placed his tea next to hers. He left small notes. "The iron doesn't smell burnt today. Is it because of you?" And then one day, he handed me a carnation, tucked into a cracked, heat-stained glass. Beneath it, a small note. "If your past is chasing you, come. Let's rewrite it together." That day, I didn't cry. But for the first time, I had to fight hard not to cry. A week later, I held his hand. That was the first day I said to myself, "I'm alive." And without knowing it yet, that was the day I began to carry you inside me, Layla. It felt like someone reached in and touched my heart. I had never known this story. I had always assumed I was born out of absence, out of accident. But I wasn't. I was the gift of the moment my mother first felt truly alive. That part of the notebook was short, but it ran deep, because right after came the lines that chilled me. "But life gives you some things and takes away others. Omer disappeared a few months before you were born. No body was found. No trace ever surfaced. Layla, I returned to loneliness, but this time I carried you with me." I lifted my head from the notebook. That sentence made the air feel colder. Who was my father? Where had he gone? Why had he never returned? That night, I lay awake for hours. Maybe my mother had never fully trusted anyone because she'd lost so much. Maybe she didn't love me less, but clung to me too tightly out of fear. And I had mistaken her tight grip for suffocation. It had been a great misunderstanding. When Omer disappeared, I was stunned. He didn't come to work that morning, nor the next day. A week passed, then a month. No one knew anything. At the factory, they said, he must have gotten into debt and run off. But I knew better. He wouldn't run. He wouldn't just leave. Not like this. When I reached this part of the notebook, I couldn't turn the pages right away. Because here, the strong Amara seemed to collapse for the first time. Her sentences were short, shaky, scattered, as if even writing them had required pauses, like grief was tugging at every word. I searched for him. I went to police stations using my fake name. "I'm looking for my brother," I said. My ID was false. I couldn't tell the truth. I couldn't explain my situation. They didn't care. "Men don't just go missing," they said. And from that day on, I never trusted anyone again, because I had only one thing left: my pregnancy. My mother's loneliness was at its most intense here. Fear, disappointment, abandonment, and growing inside her, a baby. As you grew inside me, I felt like I was shrinking. I walked more carefully down the street. I started packing fruit in my bag before going to work. For you. At night, I left the light on, so you wouldn't be afraid. You hadn't even been born yet, but I had already started raising you. I didn't cry reading these lines, but something inside me cracked and then fell back into place, because the meaning beneath those words was enormous for me. My mother hadn't become a mother when I was born. She became a mother the moment she lost something. I left the shelter, found a basement apartment I could afford. It was damp. You could hear mice at night, but the door locked. And that was enough back then. That's where I gave birth to you. The neighbor women helped. I didn't call an ambulance, still too afraid to give my name. That day, I wrote your name in this notebook for the first time, Layla, because I didn't want you to drift away. I wanted you to carry life within you. I paused, my eyes fixed on that name, Layla. My name was her hope. I had always believed I was her shame, but I was the only reason she had to live. The next paragraph spoke of an old photograph. The first outfit I ever bought for you is still in the chest. A yellow vest. Tiny. Next to it, a note. This girl is my greatest act of courage. I stood up, walked back to the chest. Beneath the piles, wrapped in old newspaper, I found a small piece of fabric. Yellow. Hand-knitted. So small. And on a torn scrap of paper, in pencil, just one sentence. I didn't give birth to this child in fear. I gave birth resisting. I pressed the vest to my chest, and in that moment, I understood something. My mother may have lost her identity, but she never lost her strength. The things she never told me about weren't because she didn't love me, but because she thought she had no right to speak of them. And maybe, just maybe, I grew up in the silence of that love. When you're pregnant, they say you want to lean on someone. I couldn't find anyone to lean on, so I learned to lean on myself first. In these pages, my mother's journal became even more stripped down. The sentences were short, direct, and quiet. The words didn't scream. They didn't cry. They simply told. And maybe that was their strongest form. After giving birth, everything had gotten harder. She had to leave the factory job, spent days alone with a newborn. Nights were broken by cries. Daytime meant worry, when her milk wasn't enough, but still, she never asked for help. The neighbors would peek through their curtains and whisper, "No husband, but there's a baby." The grocer would hesitate when writing my name in his credit ledger. They acted as if I should be ashamed of existing. But when you cried, all of it, all the words, went quiet inside me. And there, I saw that sacred place inside a mother, the one that belongs only to her child. Even when the whole world turned its back, that place stayed lit. But beyond the shame, what truly broke her wasn't poverty, it was helplessness. I wanted to work, but I had nowhere to leave you. I went to the municipality. No daycare, they said. No space. Then a woman came. "Leave your child with us," she said. "We'll watch her for 500 lira a month." But saying yes felt like betraying myself. Here my mother made a choice, a nearly impossible one, to stay on her feet or to never leave me behind. To care for you, I took cleaning jobs, nights in people's homes, early mornings scrubbing stairwells. While you slept, I'd place you in a basket, next to me, with a small toy, covered in my own vest. And every morning, as I shut the door, I thought, "Please don't wake up. Not until I'm back. Please don't wake up." Reading those words, my throat tightened. I had never seen her face while she worked. I only remembered her exhaustion, the way she constantly came and went, the net bags full of produce from the market, her scattered speech, and I had mistaken it all for rudeness. One day, that woman came again. "Look," she said, "we'll be like family. You go work. The child can grow up with us." I smiled, but inside, I cursed. Because every time I looked at you, I made myself a promise to never become like that woman. They raised me with nothing and no one, but I would never leave you to the mercy of strangers. At the bottom of the page, a single sentence stood alone. The pressure from her pen had embossed the paper. To stand by you was to defy the world, and I, quietly, defied it. That night, I closed the notebook and walked into the kitchen. My hands trembled as I turned on the kettle. And in that moment, I understood why my mother never went a day without making tea. Sometimes, a woman's entire life can be as simple as a pot of boiling water. But beneath that simplicity are battles no one ever sees. When I gave birth to you, there was no one with me. Not my mother, not a nurse, not even someone to whisper a prayer. But I had my hands, trembling, tired, and bloody. Those hands held you. I was the first to hold you. And in that moment, I made a vow. This child, I will never leave her. Because I know what it means to be left behind. When I read those lines, I press the notebook to my chest. My mother's first memory was loneliness. My first breath was silence. But now I understood. That silence wasn't the sound of defeat. It was the sound of resistance. When my mother described the night I was born, her words were brief, but deep. I was alone in the apartment. A neighbor woman came, but she stood at the door. She didn't come in. I laid out a blanket, put down a basin, propped myself up. I gave birth without screaming, because to scream would have meant shame in the neighborhood. And the moment you were born, you didn't stop crying. You screamed. And I never forgot that sound. Not for years. I had never known this story, that my birth had been so lonely, so raw, so real. To me, my mother had always been loud, harsh, but now I realized, even in her quietest moments, she had been powerful. I didn't know how to swaddle you, didn't learn how to change a diaper from my mother, I didn't read books, I didn't search the internet, but I smelled you, I kissed your hands, I forgot how to sleep at night, and I realized, motherhood isn't just knowledge. Some women study to become mothers, others learn because of children like you. My eyes filled with tears, because the bridge I thought had never existed between us had already been built. I just hadn't seen it. Or maybe I hadn't wanted to see it. My mother's first great vow was to raise me alone, but her second great vow was to forgive me one day. Every night, as I put you to sleep, I would whisper in your ear, "Don't be afraid, my girl. Turns out, your mother is here." Because that's how I grew up too. My mother was beside me, but she felt absent. Your mother may raise her voice, but only so she can be heard. I will not be one of those silent women, and if you're ever ashamed of me, it's okay. That will pass. Because children don't understand their mothers, not until they themselves become tired women. That line cut through me like a blade. I had been ashamed of my mother for years, ashamed of her clothes, of the way she shouted in the street, of the bruised fruit she brought home from the market. But now, years later, I finally understood. Those fruits fed me, those shouts protected me, and those old clothes kept me warm. I had never seen it, but she had always been there. As you grew, I began to shrink. Each year, I became a little quieter, a little more tired, a little more in the background, because you shone with light, and I didn't want my shadow to ever dim it. In these pages, my mother's journal began to shift. She was no longer writing as a woman alone, but as a mother to a growing child. Her words were softer, more reflective. But between the lines, I could still feel the old fear. I remember the day I bought your first school uniform. The white collar was slightly crooked where I had sewn it, but I ironed it the night before to make sure it sat perfectly. I dressed you in the morning. You looked in the mirror and said, "Mom, the other kids' collars look stiffer." My heart sank, because I knew theirs were store-bought. Yours was stitched by my hand. I remember that morning, but I didn't know all this. I only felt sad because my backpack was heavy and my shoes didn't match the others. I never once thought that my mother had stayed up all night sewing. After school, I came to pick you up. While the other mothers arrived in floral dresses with styled hair, I stood by the gate in my winter coat, with hands that smelled of sweat. Sometimes I saw you look away. Sometimes I heard you whisper my name. That's when I realized I had started to become invisible to you. Those lines cut deep, because they were true. There were times I hadn't wanted to introduce my mother to my friends, her loud voice, her thick eyebrows, her worn-out bag. But all she ever did was make sure I was never left alone. When they held the class mother election, you didn't write down my name. I know I never asked you to, but the fact that you didn't even suggest it burned inside me at night. I began to step back from you, so you could be more comfortable. But the only question I kept asking myself was, am I the one who should be ashamed? Or is it life that left us this alone? I remembered her face from those years, quiet, but worn. Everything had seemed normal to me, but she had chosen to fade away, so I could feel more free. There were days you didn't call me Mom. You called me that woman, said, "She doesn't understand me." And I agreed with you, because your world was already somewhere else. You were dreaming your own dream, and I was too tired to become a part of it. I paused, stared at the page. A memory surfaced, a school trip. Other children had lunches packed in cute boxes, cookies, chips, little surprises. In my bag, there was a dry bagel and an old metal thermos. I had felt ashamed and thrown the bagel away without even reading the note inside. I had slipped a note in that day. Your dreams are newer than mine, stronger than mine, but every part of me aches from carrying you. I wrote it, but I didn't send it, because I didn't want you to feel ashamed. Shame may have been your right, but I refused to be the reason for it. With those lines, it was as if my mother had forgiven me. She had understood my shame. She hadn't judged me for it, and for the first time, I was reading her words without judging her either. The day you were most proud of was my quietest evening. Your high school graduation. I was so close to you, and yet you kept me at such a distance. The flowers I held in my hands withered. The words I held in my heart never made it out. As I read those lines, a knot grew in my throat. I remembered that day, in the school courtyard, during the ceremony. While my friends posed for photos with their mothers, I made it seem like mine had gotten lost in the crowd. I hadn't wanted her to come. I asked you a few days before, should I come to your graduation? You looked away and said, "It'll be crowded, don't bother." I smiled. I understood. Once again, I was meant to stay invisible. Once again, my voice didn't belong. That night, I left a dress for you by the door. I wrote a note on the package. Wear it, because your light will shine on this fabric, and your light will make my darkness disappear. I remembered that package. I hadn't understood it at the time. I just thought, Where'd she get this from? It was clearly from somewhere cheap. I had already borrowed a friend's dress anyway. But now, for the first time, that note meant something. I waited for you at home that night. 11 o'clock passed, then midnight. The door finally opened. You weren't wearing the dress. You looked tired, but your voice was cheerful. It was amazing, Mom, you said. Do you have any photos? I asked. You didn't show me your phone. And in that moment, something broke inside me. I paused, because I remembered that night. I had nothing to share with her. And yes, I really hadn't shown her my phone, because I hadn't wanted her in the same frame with me. I shrank that night, sat in my chair for hours, didn't close the curtains, left the light on, not in case someone might see, but so it wouldn't go dark while I waited for you. The night my mother was quietly shattered was the same night I thought I was soaring. As I held up a diploma, she was learning to be erased. As I dreamed of the future, she mistook being forgotten for a victory. The next morning I got up early and went to the kitchen. My eyes were bruised underneath. My knees ached. I made you breakfast. You sat at the table, didn't ask me a thing. You drank your milk. You left. And that morning, for the first time, I stopped praying. Because in your prayers, I no longer existed. That line cracked something inside me. I had never answered my mother's prayers, and the day she slipped into silence as a mother was the same day I shouted from my highest peak. You hurt me, Layla, but I never wanted to hurt you, so I stayed silent, because children grow up over time, but a mother's silence lasts a lifetime. I closed the notebook, and in that moment, I finally heard her voice, her real voice. Not the loud one, not the bitter one, but the voice of a woman who simply wanted to be heard, to be known, to be seen. When you left home, you carried 2 suitcases, but when I was left alone in the house, I carried the weight of years on my back. When you left, the house didn't become quiet. The house became silence. In this part of my mother's journal, loneliness drifted through the lines like fog, gathering in corners, fading into the margins. When I left for university, her life began to shrink. But I never wondered about that emptiness. Not once. I promised myself I wouldn't use your empty room. I left your clothes where they were. I opened the window just 10 minutes a day to preserve your scent, as if I believed you might return. But you only came home for holidays, and even then, not always. Eventually, not at all. I remember. The first year, I called once a week. The second year, once a month. The third, only on birthdays. Talking to her was hard. It felt like we no longer spoke the same language. She talked about the produce at the market. I talked about internships. She mentioned the electricity bill. I spoke of my new scholarship abroad. I thought I was growing up. But really, I was just drifting away. You always told me things were fine. Our phone calls never lasted more than 5 minutes. But in those 5 minutes, I heard the emptiness in your voice. Still, I said nothing. I thought your pride brought you peace. But distance, I've learned, is not just about space. Distance is the luxury of not having to think about someone, and you had bought that luxury. That sentence landed in me like a stone. Distance is the luxury of not having to think about someone. I had learned how not to think of her. I didn't know if she was okay, what she was eating, when she went to sleep at night, because I hadn't wanted to know. One day your phone rang. You didn't answer. You called back 3 days later. Busy, you said. But during that time I had fallen. In the bathroom, on the floor, for hours. No one knew. No one was there. But I didn't say, I wish Layla were here, because I knew, even if you came, you wouldn't understand. By then, I had to welcome you not with my voice, but with my silence. My eyes welled up. Even if I had been there, maybe I still would have remained far, because the distance between us wasn't just measured in kilometers, it was measured in the space I had refused to leave open for her inside me. But I don't resent you, because your world was never like mine. You wanted to reach your fingers out the window and feel the wind. And I never had the courage to even open the glass. You looked ahead. I stayed trapped in the past. Because while children look to the future, mothers quietly bury themselves in yesterday. That line didn't break, but it carved a quiet fracture inside me. I had always thought my mother had fallen behind. But in truth, she had stood right in front of me. Maybe she had been the curtain, protecting me from the wind. But I mistook the curtain for an obstacle. I loved you, Layla. Even when you were ashamed, even when you were silent. All I ever tried was to know my place. And maybe I learned the most about motherhood in that one truth: to stay beside you without taking up space. That final sentence swallowed the entire sound of the journal. I didn't cry. But I didn't leave my room that night. I looked at my phone. Her name wasn't in my recent calls, not for months. And the last time I called, she didn't answer, because by then, she no longer had time left to talk. When I wanted to see you one last time, I didn't reach for the phone right away. First, I sat and thought for a long while. Is it really necessary? I asked myself. Would I be bothering her? Because by then, the distance between us wasn't just about cities anymore. It was the space of shame, of silence. As I read those lines, a dull ache echoed inside me. Because I remembered that evening, a message had arrived, short and simple. If you're free, could you stop by tomorrow? I'd like to talk a little. Mom. I was busy, truly busy. Meetings, deadlines, stress. But now, looking back, none of those excuses feel permanent. That chance passed, and it never came again. That night, I sat by the threshold of the door. I didn't expect you to come, but somewhere inside me, like a small child, there was hope. I listened closely to every car passing by. I didn't open the curtains, but I left the kitchen light on, just in case it might draw you in. I didn't come. I didn't even reply. I read the message, then left it unanswered. But inside me I thought, I'll go later. We'll talk another time. I didn't really want to talk. I just wanted to hear your voice, to feel you were there, because not feeling it was killing me. And I wanted you to know. Maybe life didn't give birth to you as my daughter. But I tried, with everything I had, to make myself your mother. My hands trembled reading that line, because all this time I thought I was just her daughter. But the truth was, she had carried me into existence with her bare hands. That night, the door didn't knock. The phone didn't ring. Silence filled every corner of the room. I went to sleep, and when I woke up, nothing had changed. Only one thing was missing: hope. The notebook pages began to thin after that. Her writing grew sparse, the spaces between the lines wider. It was as if her breath had shortened, her words grown tired. Maybe this letter will reach you too late. Maybe you'll never open the chest. Still, I wanted to write, because sometimes mothers don't speak, but writing is a way not to be forgotten. The last page had no date, no signature, only one sentence, centered, in capital letters. If one day you understand, I don't want your forgiveness, just knowing you saw me is enough. That sentence filled my eyes with tears. Because for years, I had lived inside her story without ever understanding it. Now I did. But she was no longer there. And I, for the first time, was swimming in something I could never undo. When I turned the page, there was almost nothing left, just a few lines, with long silences between them. And then, that final page. The handwriting was slightly shaky, the letters tilted, the ink smudged in places, but it was still readable. My body has grown heavy, my hands can't write as fast anymore, but I can still think. And all I think about is you, Layla, your eyes. It's been a long time since they met mine, but I saw you every single day. I paused, because I had chosen not to see her. I hadn't called, I hadn't asked, I hadn't visited, but she had been watching me all along, from afar, in silence. I didn't want to be a burden, but for every day I made you feel like I was, I quietly erased a little more of myself. I wasn't angry, not once, because motherhood isn't about waiting to be forgiven, it's about loving, until you're finally understood. These words wrapped around my heart like a quilt, warm, but the kind of warmth that arrives a little too late. In life, I had only two great achievements. First, becoming someone from nothing. Second, raising you. But maybe my most secret success was this: to love you even when you were ashamed of me. Not everyone can do that, but I did. Because you were never my past. You were always my future. A few lines later, the writing changed. Shorter sentences, more pauses. If you ever open this notebook, maybe I'll no longer be here. But remember, this house, this chest, this silence, they all waited for you. And I waited most for you to forgive yourself, because I had already forgiven you long ago. My eyes filled with tears. A few drops fell onto the page. The paper swelled slightly beneath them, as if the writing had passed to me now. And at the very bottom of the page, there was one final line, so quiet, so simple. My daughter, I always loved you, more than you'll ever know, even on the days you turned away. Amara, or whoever you now decide I was. I closed the notebook, but something inside me had opened, a door that had stayed shut for years, the door to a mother's heart, creaky, quiet, but always waiting. When I finished the journal, it felt like the air inside the house had changed. The old armchairs, the dusty curtains, the quiet kettle. Everything felt different now, more meaningful, more silent. And I realized the emptiness inside me was just like this house, a place untouched for years, yet still standing. I didn't stay the night. The next morning I took the first bus back to the cemetery. I walked slowly, and as I approached the gravestone, I held nothing in my hands. No flowers, no prepared words, just the weight of unspoken sentences, and a silence I could no longer carry. I stood. For a long time I didn't bow. I let my eyes trace the stone, Amara Weber. Between the birth and death date, a simple line. That line, that tiny carved line, represented an entire life. Mom, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I read your journal too late, maybe far too late, but I heard it. I hear you now. As I looked at her name, for the first time, I didn't hide my tears. I knelt, placed my hands on the earth beside her name. It was damp, but warm. I was angry at you. Sometimes I acted like you didn't exist, but I was never right to do so, because you were always there. I was the one who acted like you weren't. I sat down. My shoes sank into the mud. I didn't care. I laid my jacket over my knees, smoothed the soil with my hands. I want to talk now, Mom. Maybe you can't hear me. But these words have grown inside me with no place to go. I closed my eyes and whispered what poured out from within. There were days I was ashamed to be your daughter, but you were never ashamed to be my mother. I thought I was alone, but I never saw your loneliness. I mocked the dress you bought me, but it was paid for by skipping 2 days of food. I silenced your prayers. Now that silence burns my ears. Forgive me. No, I have no right to ask for that. But I need you to know. I wish I had heard you sooner. A breeze brushed against the headstone. Dry leaves scattered across my face. The birds fell silent. In that moment, it was just me and my mother. One beneath the soil, the other just above it. I buried everything that belonged to you in the past, but now I understand. The past wasn't just yours, it was ours, and you carried its weight all by yourself. I stood quietly, took a small piece of paper from my bag, a note I had written, inspired by her journal. Short, but honest. Your past is now carved into my heart. I heard you late, but you will live inside me forever. You are my light, and your name will echo in the silence I once mistook for absence. That echo will never fade. I placed the note at the head of her grave, then slowly walked away. With every step, something inside me shifted. I no longer carried her journal, but every page was etched into me now. I was no longer just a daughter. I was a woman who had faced her mother's absence and made peace with her past. As I walked back from the cemetery, I carried no flowers, no keepsakes. But inside me, for the first time, there was something I could carry: acceptance. By the time I reached home, it was already dark. The house key was still in my bag. I turned it slowly. The door creaked, just like always. The house hadn't changed. It felt like time had simply stopped there. The glass was still on the coffee table. The kitchen cloth still had lemons printed on it. And my mother's slippers still sat by the door, empty, but pointed in my direction. I stepped inside quietly, took off my shoes. I brushed my hand along the edge of the couch. Dusty, but familiar. Then something caught my eye. Wedged between the cushions, a small, old box, wrapped in faded fabric, tied with a worn ribbon. I opened it carefully, and what I found inside, words can barely hold: a handkerchief. On the corner, a crooked flower I had drawn as a child. Beneath it, a note. The handkerchief you gave me on your first Mother's Day. I kept it, because that day was the first time I felt you say the word, Mom. Next, a photograph. I was 5 years old, clinging to her, but looking away from the camera. On the back she had written, "You never looked into the lens. You always looked at life. So I learned to watch you from a little distance." And at the very bottom of the box, a small piece of yellow paper, a single sentence written on it. "If one day you return, this house is yours now, but I will not be in it. Only my voice will remain in the walls. And I hope one day you whisper the same love to your own daughter, silently, just as I did." In that moment, something inside me broke. That box wasn't just a memory of my mother. It was a mirror, reflecting my childhood, the love I denied, the affection I once dismissed. I closed the box gently, rested my head against the wall, closed my eyes. The house was silent, but this time, the silence didn't frighten me, because now I was no longer alone. My mother's journal beside me, her box at my side, and inside me, finally, her voice. "Mom, I hear you now." This story was a journey of a bond, a mother who loved in silence, and a daughter who understood too late. It was a story that proved forgiveness takes time and understanding takes courage. Silence is not always absence. Sometimes the deepest love echoes from the quietest walls. If this story reminded you of someone, maybe now is the moment to reach out. For more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Behind every voice, there's a story. And in every story, you'll find a trace of yourself.